Hi, I'm William Zwick. We're here at my school/gallery, the Zwick Academy of Fine Art in Honolulu, Hawaii. We teach classical realism here in the tradition of the old masters in sight size, using sight size as a technique for teaching. To tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up on the island and then went away to college at Laguna College of Art and Design, where I received my Bachelor's of Fine Art. I was also awarded with a partial teaching scholarship there. After there, I went on to study abroad for several years at the Florence Academy of Art, where I learned more of this traditional technique, which I wanted to bring back to the island and share with the arts community here. What we really try to focus on at this school is teaching the fundamentals and the principles of drawing and painting. We teach a wide variety of ages and skill levels here. Through live demonstrations, personal one-on-one critiques, we're able to cater to a lot of different skill levels of students. What we teach students at this school is to master the fundamentals and the principles of drawing and painting. These would be, again, accurate proportions and drawing, followed by value organization, edge quality, and color and temperature. The ultimate goal is to be able to use all of these elements to then create a painting that expresses an idea or conveys an emotion. So this painting behind me would be an example of an attempt to do that. What I was trying to capture here was the behind-the-scenes feel of what it's like to be in an artist's studio. Oftentimes when you're working one-on-one with a live model, a lot of time is spent talking with the model, just kind of learning who they are as a person, which ultimately ends up directing the painting a little bit. In this case, I was trying to show a model on break, kind of walking around this dark studio, looking at the painting that they were in, and kind of just catching that feeling of quiet and pensive attention. Some of the things that we try to focus on at the school are really locking in the fundamentals for students. The fundamentals would be an understanding of how to draw a proportional figure from life and how to draw accurately using an optical measuring tool called sight size, which I'll be going into a little bit later. We focus on value organization, an understanding of how to draw good proportions, but then we also talk about how to create a sense of atmosphere in your work and to kind of draw the viewer's gaze where you want them to look. Some examples of some student work that we have going on right now is we have a still life class where we're just starting to get into blocking in the pose and starting to establish some of those soft edges to start to create a sense of focus. So one of the things that we go over here is portraiture and figure painting. So this would be an example of one of the portraits that I did as an example for one of the classes here. One of the things that we try to talk about is how to create a sense of focus and atmosphere in your work. One of the ways that this is done is through edge control. The eyes tend to be a natural focal point just because we're so used to dealing with each other that's kind of where we're conditioned to look. But you can reinforce that with a portrait by having the areas that aren't in that focal point be a little bit softer, blend a little bit more into the edges, blend a little bit more into the background, and also have a higher sense of contrast. So if you look at where the lightest light is, that's very much surrounded by this area of very dark hair in this case, which brings a lot of attention to her eyes. At the same time, you can see that there's a difference in edge quality between the edge of her hair and the edge of her face. By having that contrast and having that sharpness right next to that area of high contrast, you create a natural focal point and something that someone's eyes are going to gravitate towards when they look at your painting. So when a student is starting to construct a piece of artwork, there's a hierarchy of importance of the different elements of a painting. The elements being accurate drawing, value, temperature, and color. So when a student first comes in here, we try to first address accurate drawing. So an example of how to build up a drawing of a figure or a drawing of a portrait kind of follows that same set of steps. So in the first step, we would be talking about anatomical landmarks, important things that you can identify in a portrait or in a figure that become very, very helpful in creating an accurate gesture and a believable sense of weight and capturing that model's likeness. So that would be where we would identify this stage, focusing on those large proportional elements and also capturing kind of their character sense of weight. As we move on, that's where you start to get more defined about identifying a shadow shape and a light shape, starting to think about the direction of the light that's starting to hit the model, and also using those shadow shapes and light shapes to start to build some of the smaller forms, whether it's on a figure like, arms and chest versus legs, or if it's on a portrait, starting to define eye sockets, features, nose, mouth, and so on. As we move past that, that's where we start to talk about your values. And when we talk about values, then you have to set a hierarchy for your values. Where is your darkest dark? Where is your lightest light? And where do all the other ones fall in between? Because if you don't establish that right from the beginning, it's very easy to get kind of lost in the process or sucked into details that you don't want to be concentrating on early on in a painting or a drawing. So this stage is where we're establishing the lightest light, the darkest dark, and also organizing the planes and the values in between. Each value represents a different angle of a plane. So in that way, you can start to sculpt the form and understand what direction the light's coming from and how it's changing and flowing. That's the main focus. So we're not yet talking about edge quality or creating a sense of focus in your work. That would be the next stage over, where through the use of edge quality, like I had been talking about on that other painting, you can direct the viewer's eye to where you want them to look and what it is you're really trying to express with your piece of artwork. So this would be the drawing and the value stage. Once we get into color and temperature, we have another way of systematically organizing that to make it very approachable, very straightforward, and very logical for how a student would go about mixing their flesh tones. This is one of the projects that we're working on right now. We're running a class for still life painting, but I thought that this would be a really good example for the technique of sight size. What sight size is an optical measuring technique where, viewed from a specific location, the subject that you're painting and your painting are exactly horizontally aligned and exactly the same size optically. What this allows us to do is, as a teacher and an instructor, so we can get our eyes exactly where the student's eyes were and be able to correct their drawing or their painting objectively, not saying I think or I feel it should be a little bit higher, but being like it needs to be a little bit higher and because of A, B, and C. And I feel that that's a very important thing to do when you're teaching. It's not just to correct their drawing, but give them an understanding of how you got there, what it was that gave you the cue that needed to be changed. Because ultimately you want to be teaching them how to be better at drawing and painting, not simply correcting their projects. As you see here, we're setting up still life. This is the initial block-in, so the drawing is still a little bit loose, but we're starting to talk about values and color. You can kind of set up a hierarchy of color the same way you can set up a hierarchy of value. You want to establish where the warmest color is or where the strongest color is. Where is that sense of focus? What are the objects in the background? How are the objects interacting with their environment to create a sense of atmosphere? So you can see through this setup that if you were to take an initial glance at this, kind of these would be the focal point object. As you can see, the values of the shadow on the coconut and the value of the shadow box are very, very close together. And this translates into a very, very soft edge when you're working on a painting. And it helps to support objects that are more in the foreground with a higher sense of contrast. Before we move on to working from live figures, it's often helpful for students to work on something that doesn't move around as much. So we use classical casts and sculptures as subject matter to talk about portraiture and also be talking about values and color and how to go about setting up a painting before they have to do it from life, from a model that's going to be swaying around and kind of hard to capture. Cast drawing and cast painting that were done in our workshops as examples of how to organize your values, be dealing with edge control, a sense of focus, all of those things that are present in a more complex painting. But since you have all the time in the world to work on it and it's never going to change, it becomes a very useful project and teaching tool for our students. So as students start a cast drawing or a cast painting project, oftentimes we'll do initial composition or value studies of the subject just to kind of familiarize ourselves with the subject matter. It's a really useful exercise and really important teaching tool. So here you see an example of a value study of this cast. Unfortunately, I didn't have an example where they are the same cast drawing, but it illustrates the point. It's an opportunity to do a smaller, kind of less pressured drawing to kind of explore the subject and also be working on establishing your value scale. So you would want to establish what your lightest light is and what your darkest dark is. This becomes important when you move on to painting, because if you think about the lightest value of an oil painting possible, which would just be pure white, well, when you look around at the world around us, or if you're painting like a portrait or a figure, the lightest part of that person, say the highlight on their forehead, it's almost never pure white. So any color that you're going to add into that will make it a darker value. So being able to control what your lightest light, how light that value is, and organizing the rest of your values accordingly becomes a really valuable skill when you move on to more complex paintings, especially figure paintings. So a value study is an excellent example and an opportunity to practice controlling that scale. So you can make that lightest light a little bit darker than you would think. And then how will that change the feel of the drawing? How can you still create a believable sense of form with a compressed value scale? Students will oftentimes do a little tinier version of this, again, just to explore what they're about to work on, and then create a larger scale, more developed drawing once they've figured out what kind of values they want to be using. The way that these courses are structured is we build people up from the fundamentals, meaning that we'll start on simpler projects and then build to more advanced projects. An example of this would be going from a master copy to a simple cast drawing to a more complex cast to working with a limited palette in color to start talking about oil paint, and then moving on to portraiture and still life and eventually into figure painting. This would be an example of one of the advanced casts in an advanced project for someone who has already had some experience organizing values and drawing accurately in the method of sight size. You can see that they're creating a focal point. They're also working on creating a sense of atmosphere and a mood to the piece while still being very technically accurate and precise with their line work. Once our students have gone through the process of learning how to draw accurately and organize their values, we start transitioning them into oil painting. So this would be an example of an oil painting portrait class that I run. And you can see a lot of the same elements apply, where we're still identifying anatomical landmarks, structural points around the body, or around the face in this case, and also establishing where the lightest light and the darkest dark are. Now we're throwing in the challenges of oil paint, which would be temperature control, color, edges, paint application. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of those elements as well. So when you're painting, you can think of it being broken down into two categories. Things that are in the light shape and things that are in the shadow shape. Things that are in the shadow shape can be used to create a sense of atmosphere. That's where you'll find a lot of your soft edges. Things that are in the light shape, you'll tend to have a little bit thicker paint and much more detail. The reason that this is you're trying to create the impression as if you were just to glance at the object, your first impression, your first visual impression of the object. And when you do that, you can either look into the light shape or into the shadow shape. Oftentimes it's the light shape. And when you do that, everything else in the shadow shape kind of gets melded together and de-emphasized. So that's the type of impression we're trying to create when we're working on our oil painting. Some other elements that come into play would again be creating a sense of focus. For this one, it was trying to capture her emotion of a glance, catching her as if she had just seen someone she knew walked in the door and trying to capture that look on her face. So another class that we run here is a master copy painting class. We choose the artist John Singer Sargent. He worked from life and opaquely, meaning that he wasn't similar to Rembrandt, who would use lots of glazing and scumbling and lots of different mediums. We know what Sargent used, and he painted directly, meaning that he applied the paint straight onto the canvas the way it was going to look at the end, which makes him a more convenient painter to copy when you're trying to teach students. We also have records of the way in which he taught his students, which becomes very interesting to try to go through the same process of painting that he described to his classes. So this is an example of one of those paintings where in the course of the painting we also have the opportunity to talk about portraiture. So again, identifying some of those drawing elements, but also looking at the way Sargent specifically utilized soft and sharp edges to direct the viewer's eye, but also the subtlety within the flesh tones and the juxtaposition of the brushiness of the clothing and the hair against the smoothness of the skin was especially interesting in this project. So another class that we run here is a still life painting class where students bring in their own objects and we work with them on setting up their own composition and then working through the different stages of creating a classical still life painting from life. So this would be an example of a student's composition that they set up. And one of the things to take into consideration when you're setting up a still life would be that pattern of shadow and light. It's as important as the objects themselves as creating an interesting, dynamic sense of light and shadow in your work. So you can see that that's what she's doing here, with a strong shadow coming in, playing off of this very, very light plane of the book, and clumping together a large grouping of flowers and balancing it with a flower in the focal point here would be an example of someone who has set up a nice still life.